Thank you, everybody, for being here. I've enjoyed all these presentations, and I hope you have too. I'm an historian of the Atlantic world, they call it, all that space that goes around the Atlantic, North and South America, the Caribbean in between, Europe and Africa. And I grew up in the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean, and that probably shaped my love of history, my love of Afro-Caribbean culture, and it shaped my academic career for sure. I would walk through the colonial city of Santo Domingo, and I got used to Dominican strangers rubbing my red curls for good luck. My Dominican nursemaid that raised me taught me how to pull a string out of my skirt, spit on it, and stick it on my forehead to get rid of my hiccups, and it works. And I grew up on Dominican music, merengue, Dominican food, sancocho, and everything else about the Dominican Republic, I think, shaped me. It was hard to leave as an adolescent. So I came to the United States. I tried to blend. I eventually ended up at the University of Florida because they have a wonderful Caribbean center there and wonderful archives. And that's where I ended up doing my graduate work. But I really thought I was going to work on Brazilian slavery when I went. And I started working in those libraries, and I came across some of the most wonderful documents that totally shaped my career and moved me in another direction back to my Dominican roots. One of the things that I found there was an amazing document, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute. But I think most Americans have the idea that African slavery is our narrative for African American history. And that's because they believe that everybody starts their history in 1619, when, as the English records say, 20 and odd Negroes were sold by Dutch slavers to American settlers or European settlers, English settlers, at Jamestown. But that is not really where we start the history, because 1619 is not really that early. And that narrative tells you that African history is the history of totally enslaved people, that it was only 20 and odd Negroes, no humanity, no names, no stories. That's really not the case. You just have to move beyond the English language records and get into other sorts of documents, which I was lucky enough to find in St. Augustine, Florida, and in Gainesville, Florida, in Cuba, in Spain, and they're all over the southern tier of our country, from Florida to California. That whole southern tier, you can find Africans written into a different type of history, and that's what I've been working on. So 1619 is not when the first African history starts in our country. It's actually 1513. And the first person that we actually can document as having set foot on our country is Juan Garrido, Juan Handsome actually. And he was a free West African man who joined some of the earliest expeditions to what is considered the New World. He comes with Juan Ponce de Leon to Española. He helps in that conquest. He helps in the conquest of Cuba and the conquest of Puerto Rico. And he explores Florida, 1513, not 1619. The other thing he does an amazing storyline. He goes back to Puerto Rico and mines for gold, owning some slaves of his own. He also participates in the conquest of the Aztec Empire with Hernando Cortés, and then he goes off with Cortés to look for some mythical black Amazons in California. So he has an amazing career. He writes his career down to tell the King of Spain what he's done, and he sends that document back to Spain where we can look at it in the archives now. And what he wanted was proper reward for his services, and he gets them. So Juan Garrido is where our earliest records start, 1513. When I saw that story, I wanted to know more about the really early history of Africans in Spain, because that's where he launched from in his expeditions. And as I started to look backwards, here's an image that, again, shapes our understanding. of a different African history in the Atlantic world. This is a baptism of a West African man from the 13th century in the Catholic Church. And this visual cue, and the records I was finding showed me that much of the history that I could find in this earlier period came out of Catholic Church records, because they documented everybody as a human being with names, with parents, with godparents. If they were enslaved, their owners are there, their ethnic groups are recorded as well, and they're serially recorded over centuries because Catholics consider this a sacrament when they baptize somebody. So that's why I can find records about Juan Garrido. And that's why I can find records of many, many other fascinating characters by looking in Spanish or Portuguese language records and not depending on only the English records, okay? I wanted to show you another wonderful character that I came across in these Spanish records. This man, or this drawing, because I don't have an actual image of him, is a person called Francisco Menendez when he's baptized in the Catholic Church. What his name was in Senegal before that, I don't know. What his name was when the English enslaved him, I don't know. What his name was when he went off and fought with the Yamasee Indians in 1715, I don't know. I only know him as Francisco Menendez, and he was one of the other fascinating characters that I come across and started to work on as a graduate student. It turns out that he is the founder of the first free black town in what is today's United States, in Spanish Florida. It was called Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose. Everybody just says Mose now. And he had run from his enslavers in Carolina, fought with the Yamasee Indians for 2 years, and when they were going to be defeated by a united English force, he runs to Florida. And I wondered, why is he running to Florida? And what I came to discover was that the whole religious system, political system, legal system, economic system of the Spanish was totally different than that of the Anglo world he was running away from. In the English world, enslaved people were considered property, chattel slavery it's called, and that's why they would record things like 20 and odd Negroes. It's a piece of property. Cross into Florida and you find a different system altogether, and it goes all the way back beyond where my 13th century image goes. It goes way, way back to Roman law, which considered slavery a legal condition. It was not a racial condition, and it was not perpetual. It was a condition into which anybody could fall, including enslaved people who would be re-enslaved from other countries, such as Africa, some of the African countries, or it could have been a Spaniard who was condemned to slavery for crimes. So anybody could become a slave. Anybody could get out of slavery. You could buy yourself out of slavery in a system the Spanish in Cuba called Coartacion. You could be freed by the state, freed by your owner for your merits and services. So it's a permeable condition, not a lifelong perpetual racial condition. And that's why when these people start running from the Carolinas down into Florida, they're entering a different world, and they're entering a different system, and they're regaining their humanity and their names, even if they're a little bit changed by the baptismal situation. And they're in being incorporated into the community, just as Francisco Menendez was. And when enough of those people run into the Spanish world, this is the first underground railroad south, if you think about it. You may have read about Underground Railroad in your history, American history, and usually they're talking about much later time period running up to Canada to escape slavery. But this is the earliest ones that I found running from Carolina. 2 men, 3 women, and a nursing child in a stolen canoe made it from Carolina down to St. Augustine, Florida, and the governor, being a good Catholic subject, received them, has them baptized, frees them, And they began that system, the earliest that I can find at least. And from that point on, everybody is trying to run from the Carolinas either into the indigenous interior or to a Spanish world where they have learned through the grapevine that there is freedom to be had, that you will be given land, you will be given occupations of all sorts, I find in these records. And so, Gracia Real, this is an artist rendering, but it's made from a group of people got together, myself as a wonderful opportunity for me as a grad student. The Black Caucus of the state legislature of Florida sent me to Spain to do that research, and I was able to find the census of the villagers, a description of the town, a map. I could find the baptismal, marriage, and burial records for many of the villagers. And with that, the Black Caucus also funded 2 years of archaeological work at Mose. And that was led by my director and wonderful mentor and still a friend, Dr. Kathleen Deegan. And so this collaboration of archaeology, history, and all sorts of other work went to have a final conclusion of a museum there now. I hope if you get to go to St. Augustine on tourism, you'll go and see Fort Mose, as they call it. It's a museum. The local community, the Fort Mose Historical Society, I've worked with for 25 years now. They play the roles of the villagers I found on that census. They reenact all the history of that place. A big battle in 1740 called the Battle of Bloody Mose. Francisco Menendez was a hero in that battle, and he writes to the King of Spain also to recount his services. And he didn't hear back immediately. Spain and England were in a global war at the time, and the king was a little busy, I guess. He didn't answer immediately. And Menendez says, "I'm getting on a ship, and I will come and see you in old Spain," he called it. So these kinds of characters are really important, I hope, in transforming the narrative of African history in this country and of the whole Atlantic world, if you will. So our drawing of Mose, they've got a National Park Service grant and some other grants. It's been put on the National Park Service Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. It's a National Historic Landmark. And because I'm with UNESCO now, we also got it a UNESCO Site of Memory designation. It'll never be developed into a condo as many of the other places were in Florida. So it's safe, and they're going to do a reconstruction of this fort. I hope it'll be ready maybe by next year. Next slide is some of the wonderful folks in the reenactment group that I talked about, playing the roles of the characters, and they're truly committed to this. I'm committed to this change of narrative as well. And when I found these wonderful records, I realized there's so much more across the whole world that Spain held colonies in, all the way to the Philippines. I can track free black militias like Francisco Menendez led. And there's a different narrative to be told. You just have to work at it. And so I want to do that. And I realized that a lot of the documents that I work in are really, really fragile. They're so old, they crumble sometimes almost. It's like painful to an historian. And I realized that they're under constant threat, and even more as climate change happens, geopolitical instability, poverty, inequality, all these things affect how these records are kept. And so I got a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to start a project that I call Slave Society's Digital Archive. And I train my own grad students, but also grad students, librarians, whatever, in the other countries in which I work. We train them, we pay them, we equip them to save these records, and then we put them up for everybody to have available to them for research on online, slavesocieties.org, and you can find it if you're interested. We've worked primarily in Cuba and Brazil in the beginning because those were the places that were the most African imports went to in that Atlantic slave trade. But we've expanded to Colombia, another major site, and we have a new project in Guadalajara, Mexico, and more in Colombia, Cartagena particularly. And I have student teams in all those places that we've managed to incorporate in this, so the next generation can start to save this material as well. Here's our Slave Society's digital archive, a little screenshot of it, but you can see the major collections I just talked about, with smaller collections also from Angola, Benin, Cabo Verde, and Uruguay. So we're always adding to it, and we're training our own students also at Vanderbilt in internship roles and so on to learn. My part is the history and the paleography and the Spanish and Portuguese, but other people do the high-tech stuff for the database that I don't understand at all. But this is the kinds of records I find. It's really painful as an historian to see it. And some of the things that we started with in Cuba no longer exist in physical form. So it's really a pressure to try to save these. And one of the places I worked in Cuba, here's the streets of that same place when Hurricane Irma came. And this is as climate change gets worse, I fear for everything. In fact, Mose now being on the coast is somewhat endangered itself. So we have to do something about it. And so I thought I was only going to do a one-year project in Cuba and Brazil, and it ended up that I had to keep generating funds and getting grants and so on to keep this work going. But we've managed to do that, thankfully. And some of the places we work, as I mentioned, are under very much stress and duress, and it's painful. We were in Cuba when it was the so-called special period. That's what the Cuban government called it, when the Soviet Union collapsed and could not finance Cuba anymore. There was no medicine, no food, no petrol, no anything. It was terrible. And this is why, we have some records that no longer exist. When we worked in João Pessoa, Brazil, multiple thefts of our equipment interrupted the work. And when we worked in Quibdó, a little town on the Pacific side of Colombia, the Colombian government and the FARC rebels were shooting it out right outside the town. So it's one of the graduate students called it guerrilla preservation. We try, but it's hard, and I say that as someone privileged to live here in Nashville, a comfortable life. So the people that I work with and that I train there, when I go back, I try to help in any way to train them and get their professional lives up and going. So this is one of our teams in Cartagena, Colombia, a beautiful, beautiful place. I was back to see them all this in August. And some of my grad students now have grown up, and they're off being professors in other universities, and they're training their own students. So the work continues that way. And some of them are there, young prof from Wisconsin, Pablo Gomez, David Lefevre, René Solodre-Lafrance. All of these are teams. So our work is partially just for preservation, partially for scholarship, so that people like I have to do to get my job, but also so that the youth can find out about their past and not think that everybody had no names and was barefoot in a sugarcane field somewhere. I want them to know about these exciting, adventuring people who risked it all to make it across that international border and get free and create a different history for themselves and their descendants. And when I talk about descendants, that's another group that can use these records. People have contacted me to try to find their ancestors, and one of them was this wonderful artist, Karen Hampton, who has both European and English and African heritage, and her ancestors are in the records we save, as were others, a wonderful dance anthropologist, Yvonne Daniel, who works on Cuban dance and Brazilian dance. She shares ancestry with Karen, as a matter of fact. And that was an amazing find. And another person that also contacted me is a radiologist at George Washington University Hospital who is descended from Jorge Biasu, is what the Spanish called him, George Biasu. He was a major slave rebel in Saint-Domingue, leading the Haitian slave revolution. He later evacuated and went to Spanish Florida, which is where I found his records. He fought Seminole Indians on behalf of the Free Black Militia of Spanish Florida. And eventually, when he died there, he's buried with full honors, full military honors, in the cemetery in St. Augustine, Florida. So the difference between a full military burial in St. Augustine, Florida, and 20 and odd Negroes in a record is sort of symbolic of what I'm trying to do differently. You know, you just cannot depend only on that. And I want children to know. So I wrote a 4th grade textbook for Florida where they have to learn local history, and I put all of these people in it. And at least it's there for now. And we'll hope. So we did that, and I do a lot of public history work, museum work, and documentary work, and podcasts, whatever I can do to help spread the word. And mostly I'm worried about the children learning a different narrative of their past. And so a wonderful woman, Glenette Tilley, did this book for children about Fort Mose. And one of my former grads, David Wheat, who works with me now still as a young prof, was in Spain this summer and found a comic book in Badajoz, Spain. It's a little nowhere place on the border, and it's Francisco Menendez on the cover. I was thrilled when he sent it to me. So we try. We're racing against time, and we're trying to change that narrative and save what we can before it's gone. As we're speaking today, I'm afraid we've lost something already.